Hi everyone, great to have you back. All right, I believe in the last video we stopped at where we created our custom component, which is what I'm still showing on the screen, which is a Z component. I walked you through how, or when you just bootstrap a new Spring Boot application, what are the details that you have on it? You have their Spring Boot application, and we explored all the details within this. We're able to look at what all this means in probably we went in deep, right? And I'm sure it's beginning to sink in, right? So it doesn't so every annotation you see out there is always just important to just dig in a little bit to see what is basically under the hood, to know exactly what is happening. And we're able to I think we're able to end it on the notes where you can create your custom components, and the key detail is that you have this annotation which is a component. And what happens is you have this guy called a component scan. The moment it detects that this is a component, it makes it a bean, right? It makes it a bean. Now that we have concept of beans, now that we have so many, we'll be creating a lot of services. Now that we'll be creating repositories and the likes, and I was able to show you critically that repository, service, component in itself, configuration, every single one of them have at the base config you will always see as component. However, how is this managed? So Spring Boot has a concept called inversion of control. Inversion of control, which is basically called IOC. IOC is inversion of control. Now, the beautiful thing about IOC is that it helps you manage everything, all your beans, right? By default, Spring basically gives you singleton. So there is this design pattern, which is I think singleton design pattern, if I'm not wrong. I usually mistaken both single responsibility and singleton design pattern, but basically they basically do the same thing, right? So the design pattern basically tells you you have one particular object in the instance of your entire application, one singular instance. So that is the same concept that the IOC basically follows. But I'm going to be showing you something in Spring Boot that you could change that a little bit by a concept of changing the single thing to something else. And we're going to be looking at that because there will be times you write some Spring Boot application and you are not sure, you are not entirely sure if you were to leave it as singleton, what would happen, right? What would happen if you are dealing with things that have to do with a heavy calculation and you want every calculation to be done afresh? That we'll be looking at, that and many more will be looking at. So let's quickly proceed. Let me show you the concept of Spring IOC, which is the inversion of control. Without delving into a lot of details in this video, how can you assess the beans? How can you assess all the components, basically your services and the likes, but in quotes, the beans you've created in your application? How can you assess it? Now, Spring provides you something called application context. Application context, right? It's called application context. However, to assess the application context, right, there is an interface that is basically given to you. It is always advisable. Please take this words carefully. It's always advisable you don't mess with the application context, right? Because the IOC manages it for you. But there are some cases where you just need to assess it because you need to do some kind of, you need to actually call it at a place where there is no configuration, there is no Spring context available, there is no, more like you don't have the web context available, and you still need to access it. That is very much possible in Spring. And to basically do that, we have a way to bring that in, right? To do that, there is a safe way that Spring has basically provided for us, which I would be showing you in this video. And this is how you go about it. You implement an interface called application called application context aware. So this does not directly assess the application context, but basically just assess it. It assesses it via another method, but still gives you gives you the interface of the application context. So let's finish up the implementation so this makes better sense. All right. So this is how you bring in the application context, and what you want to do is that you want to create a getter to expose it as a static method, so it's available throughout your entire application. So this is how you go about it. I'll create a private static application context, then I'll just call it context, right? So now bringing this in, now I need to tell you that, okay, I need you to basically do some form of setter mapping here, because this comes in by default the moment you implemented this. So this is the application context. You need to map these two together. As you can see, they have the same type. So I would say this does context is equal to context, or you could just simply say context equals to context. Now that I have this, I can simply do at getter here, right? At getter here. So this at getter basically creates a getter for me. So if you were to compile this and run this, you would see that this creates a context for me. So I'm using Lombok here to basically shorten the code. So how would it look like? So if I were to go in and just build this application, if I were to go in and build this application, so I'm building, so I'm done building. So let's check the targets. Let's check the target directory. Let's go into this part and open this part up. And as you can see, what do you see? You have the application context and you have the getter. This is the getter that was generated for us. So this is basically what we would have. But I just created the short form by using Lombok. Now that we have this, you can then access all the beans, right? You can access all the beans in this application, which is the beautiful thing, right? You can access everything in this application, right? Now, if you were very observant, you will see this is already throwing a beans exception, because the application context is more about managing the beans, the life cycle of the beans, the creation, right, of the bean, and how they basically should I say, they interact with each other. It is very critical, which is also another question I'll just bring in right here. Would you prefer setter injection, constructor injection, or field injection for your beans? This is a typical interview question. Always prefer constructor injection, because Spring basically they advise you to use constructor injection. The beautiful thing about it is you can easily tell when you start having things like cyclic dependency. Constructor injection points it out very early enough. All right. So we've been able to talk about this something beautiful. We've been able to bring in the application context aware. Now we have the application context. We can access it anywhere. Now the question comes in. Okay, Ezekiel, where does this really come to play? When do I need it? Now take this scenario for instance. All right. Now the scenario is I have a static method, right? I go in. Let's go into my custom service. I have my custom service. I have a public. Let's just create a public static do some work. Public static, let it just be a void. I'll say do some work. All right. Now, by default, you cannot reference a non-static context in a static context. I'm sure you usually see this. What it means is, hey, this is a web application, right? And you're trying to access a bean, or trying to access a service that have a context in a dimension, should I say, in a way that doesn't have any context. So you cannot call a bean directly or a service directly within a static method. That would fail woefully. But the cool thing is you can use the application context in here, and it will basically give you the details. Now, what do I mean? Now check this out. Say I do this. Let's bring in one of these beans. Let's bring in a Z component. What did we do here? We didn't do anything. Okay. I have a component service here. So let's wire in this component service into this my component service. So I'll bring in this. I'll use at required as constructor. What this basically does for you is just to create a constructor injection, right? It just creates a constructor injection for you. All right. So I have this. I'll make it a final. So this is wired in. Now, if I bring this in here and I try to do something with it, see what it tells me. Let's see. Non-static field component service cannot be referenced from a static context. You see, this is exactly what I mean. So you cannot reference from a static context, but the moment I remove this static, you see this becomes available. So I can then call whatever method is available within this component service. Now, this is the beauty of where the application context aware works. It's possible you've written some form of beautiful code, right? And within a static method, in some logic, you need to call a bean, you need to call a service to do some work. How would you access it? That is where the application context can work beautifully. So in this regard, remember, this is a what? This is a static. This is basically a static context. So I can come in here and just call in the application context. I can just bring in the application context, right? So if it's a static method, I need to reference it from the base name. So I'll say EBS application dot get context, right? I get my context, right? And the context gives me this. Then from this context, remember it's static. From this context, I can then get any bean I want. Remember, we could not wire in this because of this part. But check this out. With this, I can say get bean. I can get the bean. I use the name. I can use the name, or I can use the class. I can just say component service dot class, and that basically gives me this component service bean. Now, where would you find this rather useful? Sometimes when you start developing, right? Let me just mark it here. When you start developing in your global exception handler, right? Global exception handler. I'm sure you would have faced this scenario. For those already practicing, you find this scenario very useful. In your global exception handler, this will come in very handy. Very handy. Where you are using at rest controller advice. At rest controller advice to catch all your exceptions, right? You would probably have a lot of static methods in there, and sometimes you can't inject the bean directly. Sometimes, right, based on your construct, you could use this method to get things done. So with this, I have this available. Now, remember, I ran this in here. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to create a constructor here. I'll just say private component service, private, I'll say public, sorry. I want to create a constructor. So public component service. All right, and I'll just say, I want to log. I'll say log.info started component service. All right, so let's run this application. So if we run this application, we would expect something beautiful to happen, right? So it means when this is being called, you will see this basically injected, right? We would see this basically coming in. And what I would do also to make this more cool, I would say public. I'm not going to make it static for you to see. We can basically access it. I'll just say string check me, right? Check me, and I go in here and I just log some information, say this is running, and I'll just basically just return. Woo! I just say woo, this is working. All right, so if we go back to this part, what did I do? Okay, I missed the quotes. All right, I missed the quotes. So if we go back to our application where we actually use the application context, I can then use this bean to call the check me. Can use this bean to call check me, right? And let's see. So this bean calls check me, and I'll just basically do some form of assertions basically to ensure. I'll just say log dot info, right? And I'll say check if s dot contains, I want to see this string. I'll just say this part s. So I'll bring this here. I'll just bring this here. Yeah. So I'll say s dot contains. Woo. I'll just basically check that. So let me be sure it's accurate. How many did I place in there? Okay, I'll just copy this. Let's just pick this to be sure that it's contained in here. So I'm gonna place this in here. All right, pretty cool, right? Now, I'm going to show, so I expect that this will give me this. So let's be sure that we are within this service. I'm going to say currently in my customer service. Okay, let's take away the space. All right, so let's check this out. All right, so if I run this application, so you have this here coming in here, this check me is basically here. Then within this part, I'm doing some work. Now, if I'm doing this, this will not, if you look at this, this will not get called. So let's ensure it's called. So I'm going to call it immediately after this. I'll call it immediately after this Z component. Now just come here. Just come here, place it in here, just do some work, and let's see what will happen. Right? Okay, so let's run this application. Okay, so let's check the logs and see what is happening within the logs. All right, so if you see, Z component is running. We already have this. Now, if you notice, what do you see next? Component service is running. Where is it coming from? It's coming from this component service. Where? Because remember, I created a bean. I added a bean in here, right? I added a constructor, sorry. I added a constructor, and within this part, this basically runs first because a command line runner ensures that this runs first, and that is why you're seeing component service is running. And if we then go back, so we've been able to ascertain that this was called. Now, what about this bean.checkme? If you see the bean.checkme, what does it do? It checks, it actually prints component service is running, and that is why you find it here, component service is running. And what do you notice also? Woo, this is working, right? We ensure that this is working, and we did not print it. Rather, what did we do? We ensure that we added this part, which is currently in my customer service. Then we ensure that this contains this. So we are supposed to see this, and we're supposed to see true. And if we look at it, that is what you have in here. All right, pretty cool, right? Pretty cool. Now I'm sure that you are able to see that with the application context, you can access any bean within the application, and it makes it pretty super awesome, right? Where you can basically play around your beans to call it basically anywhere within the service, either within a web context or a static context. You basically can have it, and that is beautiful in itself, right? That is beautiful in itself. So in the next video, what I'll be doing is, what if I mentioned something earlier? What if I'm doing some form of monetary implementation, and I don't want just one instance to be running. I want for every instance of that computation, it should be running every single time. That we'll be looking at in the next video. See you guys in the next video.